It's week 2 of my rock studies. This week, I've left behind my line art and I'm drawing with a single directive. All of my rocks must be made using only blocks of color. Last week, I nailed down the general shapes of rocks. I found through studying that many rocks are comprised of rectangular, circular, or triangular shapes, and that horizontal and vertical lines play a crucial role in selling the texture and 3D shapes of these rocks. But line art can only take you so far. Yes, you can convincingly draw a rock with just lines, but my quest to learn the secrets of how to draw rocks requires that I also pay attention to the color of rocks and the shadows they cast. So this week, I started drawing rocks in color, and this is what I learned. To get started, I once again wandered the depths of the internet in search of rocks to draw. Now that I was more concerned with color and shading, I decided to narrow my search parameters by looking at drawn pictures of rocks from other artists and anime backgrounds. This is a good technique to fall back on when the thing you're trying to learn to draw might be complicated in real life. Looking at a real rock, it can be easy to get lost in the variety of textures, shades, and colors going on. Looking at how someone else drew a rock, you generally find that they've simplified a lot of these features down to their most important parts. I'm a big advocate for adding a cartoon or anime tag to your image searches to find simplified versions of what you're trying to draw. It's helped me a number of times over the years. A good, simplified drawing will keep only the most vital elements for making something look the way it does, meaning all that clutter from a real-life picture is taken out. That's how I filled my first study page this week with simple expressions of rocks. You know, there's just something so charming about 2 or 3 color images. It's amazing how much visual information you can get across with as little as 2 colors. Look at these rocks, for example. Without their shading, they're just blobs. But with their shading, they suddenly have depth, texture, and roundness. Isn't that cool? Or what about these rocks, where you get textural information like ridges or a sense for shade, midtones, and highlight? A little bit of color goes a long way when used right. But the shading here isn't thrown on randomly. In many cases, you can clearly see the basic rectangular, circular, or triangular shapes. Sometimes shading is as simple as following the rules of how to shade a rectangle, with clear edges marked by the existence of corners on your rocks. In fact, as I was working, I found that to be a common trend regardless of the shape. Shadows often began around the peaks and sharp edges of a rock. See how even in a rounded rock, the shadows begin at the tip of a shape's peak, or how the shadow hugs the edges of a longer rock, starting and ending at opposite pointed ends. This isn't a hard rule, of course, as there are other rocks clearly showing their shadows ending in seemingly random spots, but it's a good guideline. When shading rocks, pay attention to where the peaks and edges of your shape are, and use those as starting points for your shading. Various other factors like the direction and intensity of the light, as well as the presence of other elements that could affect how light hits the rock, will add an extra layer of complication, but I'm keeping my studies simple for now. Once I was feeling good about my simple rock studies, I turned my attention over to landscapes, which would test my ability to play with color to render shadows, highlights, and texture. My first run was a little haphazard. I started with a basic mountain which had clear swaths of shadow caused by its pyramid-like shapes, but I wanted more. So I estimated more color blocks caused by valleys dug into the hillside. This added more little triangles that gave the impression of parts of the mountain digging inward. Some sparse use of highlights gave me a little more texture variety, but I'll admit I was just trying not to make the side of the mountain in the light look so plain compared to how nice the shaded side was looking. Notice how the areas where the biggest patches of shade occur are places where there are sharp edges to the mountain's shape. But I could still force your eye to see shapes in areas where the edges of the mountain give no indication there's a change in the overall shape. Next, I got a little fancy with it and tried for a more dramatic cliff mountain I saw online. This one made it impossible to only use 2 or even 3 colors to sell the shape and texture of the mountain. For this one, I was really challenging myself to focus on texture through shading. You'll notice a lot of the fundamentals are still present. Cliffs and hillsides often feature that squiggly line coming down from the peak, and I use that here. Vertical lines play a crucial role in making the cliffside of the mountain read as a sudden sheer drop off the edge. A lot of them are more diagonal leaning to sell the slope of the mountain, but the effect is the same. I added a few extra shaded lines creeping up the cliffside to sell that verticality. And though I can't describe any other shape here as horizontal, there's a definite sense of some rocks jutting out over others or dipping back inward where the shadows hit. This one definitely felt more random with its shading, but by keeping things relatively blocky, it didn't become a mess of shades. The predominant blocks of color are still long, vertical rectangles, and that keeps the left looking like a steep cliffside. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. Okay, full disclosure, I didn't get to spend a whole week on the second half of my rock studies like I had planned to. My week got sorta derailed, and I didn't get back around to drawing rocks till I felt like moving on to my next topic. So this last section will be a little short and random in its focus. I've got a handful of rocks I drew where I allowed myself to use line art. These were all taken from some anime references, which made me notice that a lot of them had some awkward shading that didn't necessarily align with what I'd been learning so far. But I chalked this up to lighting and stylistic choices, since this was just a still frame of an anime. It's unrealistic to expect every frame of an anime to display perfect examples of how to shade things. And they still got their point across, so, it is what it is. These were just my warm-ups for the day anyway. I then decided to tackle a dry lake bed like what I'd talked about last week, except in color this time. I think it turned out really neat. The same rule I mentioned before applied, where I just drew a bunch of squiggly, jigsaw-like lines stretching into the distance, then I slapped some color under it. That's a dry lake bed, alright. A little tedious to draw, but so satisfying in its execution. Then I went back to drawing rocky outcrops, but I was focusing on color a little more. Here's a fun fact about shading. If your subject is under a warm light, the shadow it casts tends to be cool, and vice versa, where if your light is cool, your shadows tend to be warm. In my first round of color studies, I was shading by picking a color that was darker than the base color I picked. This is fine, it gets the effect across, but it can make your art look very flat and monotonous to only use varying shades of the same warm or cool colors. I didn't draw many of these, but take a look at the studies I was doing where I used a warm color for the base of the rock and cool colors for the shadows. Doesn't it pop way more? These have style. They fit within a setting. Knowing how to pick the temperature of your shadows can go a long way in making your work stand out. It's a topic I plan to cover in more detail later. That brought me to the unexpected end of my rock studies. I'll continue these behind the scenes, but I sorta want to move on to other topics. Namely, in the theme of learning to draw the elements, next week I'll be starting to look at how to draw fire, something else I am currently pretty bad at. It should be fun. With that, I'll wrap up this shorter newsletter with the painting of the week and send you on your way. Last week, I tried out glazing to relatively satisfying results. Glazing, as a recap, is the painting technique of watering your paint down to the point that it becomes transparent enough to create a wash over your work without obscuring what's underneath. It's a really nice way to shade, and after trying it once, I wanted to get better at it. That brought me to this week's painting, where I'd originally said I was going to focus on rendering a single object as well as I could, but my brain was still in rockland, and I didn't think just drawing a rock would be all that interesting to look at. So I went a little off script and got a little more landscapey with my rocks, and a little abstract. This one ended up testing both my glazing skills and my texture skills. I found using a raggedy flat brush helped me get those nice, consistent lines swooping across the rocks. I finally changed my paint palette and set up a spare piece of canvas nearby to test my glazes before throwing them on my work canvas, and I think that helped a lot. There's a lot of color depth and gradation happening here, way more than I was achieving previously without glazing. I still think my technique has a long way to go, but I'm taking baby steps in the right direction. I look forward to getting better to the point I can look back at these paintings with slight embarrassment for my lack of refinement. But that's all I really have to say for this painting, so we're wrapping up early. Tune in next week for drawings of fire and more painting progress. Thanks for listening.